So part 2 is dedicated to the analysis of a beautiful poem called The Falling Leaves. It's a poem which is representative of women's World War I poetry, but it's also a poem that the more that I looked into it, the more I appreciated, and I hope it'll be the same for you. Now, back in 1918, when Ungaretti wrote his famous poem Soldiers, the association between autumn and death, between falling leaves and the precarious nature of life, was of course not new. What was unique was his compression of meaning and the organization of those few words into a poem, which leaves you speechless. But some years before, in 1915, a young woman poet also wrote a reflection on war and death using a similar comparison. It's in a poem, as we said, called The Falling Leaves, written in 1915 by a poet called Margaret Postgate Cole. Now, Cole was a pacifist, an atheist, and a feminist. She had studied at the famous Girton College, Cambridge's first women's college, which had been founded back in 1869. And as an activist, the First World War, with its different treatment of men and women, its different expectations of men and women, really sparked her strong desire to speak out against injustice. And so when her brother was imprisoned for refusing to join up, also a pacifist, she helped him to secure status as a conscientious objector. And then, for the duration of the war, she continued to fight against conscription, claiming the right for all male pacifists to stay out of the conflict. However, for an activist, a decrier of injustice, this poem, The Falling Leaves, is a very quiet anti-war poem, which rather than shouting from a podium, speaks with extreme sadness and poignancy about wasted life. Today, as I rode by, I saw the brown leaves dropping from their tree in a still afternoon. The scene is set. It's a cold afternoon in late autumn, and there isn't a breath of wind. The air is completely still. The poetic voice, the speaker, enters the scene quietly. She watches the leaves and then rides away in silent reflection. The leaves are falling straight to the ground, thousands of them, from branch to ground, directly, heavily, thickly, but in absolute silence, as if the tree had decided to drop them all in that quiet afternoon, that quiet, windless moment. And so many of them fall that the bleak, wintry sunshine is blocked out. The leaves, as they fall, first bring to her mind a heavy snowfall. No snow which can fall thickly and heavily, but can create that atmosphere of incredible stillness and silence. Snowflakes which, although they are white, can darken the sky. But then they bring to mind something else. They bring to mind what is happening over the Channel in battles which were taking place in 1915, such as the Battle of Ypres near the Flemish town of Ypres. And the carpet of fallen leaves becomes the multitude of fallen soldiers, brave soldiers who have died there. Here too, the wind is not the agent. The soldiers have not been made to fall by the wind of old age or the wind of sickness and ill health. Instead, they're brave, beautiful young men who are now withering on the Flemish soil. The leaves are like snowflakes. The leaves are like snowflakes. And they are like a gallant multitude who are also like snowflakes. Now, this pattern, this beautiful pattern, which you can see inside the poem, points to something about its structure. In fact, what we're going to discover as we look at the poem in more detail is how this structure has been very tightly and very finely organized. The poem is in 12 lines. It's one long single sentence finishing with this full stop. But after 6 lines, there is a division with a semicolon. And in fact, that 12-line poem can be divided into 2 sestets, which are separated by this colon. If we take them as 2 sestets, we'll start to see how each sestet mirrors the other. For example, both begin with the actions of the speaker. Today, as I rode by, I saw, and wandered slowly thence, for thinking. And the similarities, the mirroring, of course, doesn't stop there. In fact, the tenor of the 2 similes are both contained in the second line of each sestet, the brown leaves in the first, and a gallant multitude in the second. Then, on the 4th line of each sestet, we find the reference to the lack of wind, the absence of wind, both literally, when no wind whirled, and metaphorically, slain by no wind. Then on the 6th line, the 6th lines of both sestets, we find the vehicle of the similes. They fell like snowflakes and like snowflakes. The second sestet mirroring the first sestet perfectly. And if we continue to look at the poem and examine the sound features, we find that this mirroring continues. Have a look at the rhyme scheme, and we find that in the first stanza, by, tree, noon, sky, lee, noon, we have an ABC rhyme scheme. The second sestet, thence, tude, lay, ence, strewed, clay, DEF, DEF. So we get a perfect reflection of the rhyme scheme in both of those sestets. This continues in the line lengths. I mean, when you look at the line length, you can see the alternation of short lines and longer lines very clearly in the first sestet. It doesn't seem so obvious in the second sestet, but it's still there. In fact, if you start to divide the lines into syllables, then you can count 6 syllables in the shorter lines and 10 syllables in the longer lines, and this is regular and constant throughout both of the sestets, 6-10, 6-10, 6-10. The alternation of shorter and longer lines. Still focusing on the sound features, there are also the repetition of certain sounds to create effects, such as alliteration or consonants. Both balance between the 2 sestets. Here, for example, the alliteration of the w sounds at the beginning of words is concentrated into the central part of both sestets. Here, when no wind whirled them whistling to the sky, and in the second sestet, which now all withering lay, slain by no wind or age of pestilence. So a strong alliteration of w in the central part of both sestets, which is further reinforced by the repetition, the consonants of l and f sounds in the last lines of the sestets. Here we find thickly, silently, they fell like snowflakes, wiping out the noon. And in the second sestet, like snowflakes falling on the Flemish clay. They're both soft labial or tongue-tip consonants. So at first glance, a poem which seems in free verse, but on examination is a finely structured poem in two mirrored parts which perfectly suit the content. I mean, what is left for us now is to make a full reading and to see how all these elements combine together in this quiet, powerful, beautifully structured anti-war poem. So I'll make a last reading. Today, as I rode by, I saw the brown leaves dropping from their tree in a still afternoon, when no wind whirled them whistling to the sky, but thickly, silently, they fell like snowflakes wiping out the noon. And wandered slowly thence, for thinking of a gallant multitude which now all withering lay, slain by no wind of age or pestilence, but in their beauty strewed like snowflakes falling on the Flemish clay. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and till next time.